Hi, I'm Rashonda. I'm the creator of artbyrow.com, where I help hobby artists grow by teaching them how to focus on the process rather than the outcome. I specialize in developing creativity, creating more art in less time, and using graffiti art to generate ideas instead of always wondering what you should be working on. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, subscribe so you get notified whenever new videos get uploaded. Now let's head on over to the art studio and do some drawings. We're going to work on today's tutorial together. Let's head on over. All right, so today we are going to work on a watercolor sunset painting, and I'm doing mine on artist trading cards. So what I did was I took a sheet of watercolor paper and I cut them down into artist trading card sizes. The reason I do this, I like doing all of my stuff on artist trading cards if I can, because working smaller saves me a lot of time, which means I get things finished. I'm one of those people that has a habit of starting something and then it gets overwhelming and I end up not finishing it. So by working small, it helps me to actually be able to finish what I start, and that helps build some momentum. It helps boost my confidence, and I can put them in a binder. There's sleeves that they're made for like Pokemon cards or baseball cards or whatever. There's pockets that you can put them in, and then they go inside a binder, and then you have a nice little portfolio of your artwork. So there's a lot of advantages to working on artist trading cards, and I understand that for a lot of you that doesn't seem practical, or maybe you don't want to work smaller, and that's fine. This can be done at any size. The techniques and the concepts, the way you work, everything's the same. The only difference, obviously, is just going to take a little bit longer. So what I'm doing is I am taping this down so it's easier to work with. And I'm trying to keep the edges where the tape overlaps fairly even around the border of my paper, so that it creates a little frame around it. And all I'm doing is I'm taking masking tape, tearing off a length of it, and then I'm sticking it on my pant leg before I put it on my paper here, because that helps when you remove it so that it doesn't tear the paper. So, little hack. Just stick it on your shirt or your pants or whatever you have available. Pick up some of those fibers on the adhesive and then stick it down. So what I have here is I have a cup of water. This is just a little, I think it's a yogurt container that I've been using for years. It's a nice size. It's sturdy enough that it's held up over the years. I have a paintbrush. I like these flat paintbrushes. You can use whatever you want. It's a matter of personal preference for what you're doing, what feels comfortable for you. And then I'm using these Prima Tropical paints. I like the colors for this. So today, as I said, we're going to be doing some watercolor sunsets. So this paint kit comes with this little card, and the numbers correspond with the pans in the tray, and you put your colors on there, and then that way you can see what your colors are going to look like when they're on the paper. So it makes it really easy to pick out the colors that you want to use for your painting. So I'm going to start, this will be a wet on wet. So we're just going to put a little bit of plain water. Now, if you're going to be working bigger, you might want to have 2 containers of water, one for rinsing your brush and then one for your clean water to put on your paper. I'm just going to go ahead and wet this whole thing. And what that does is it helps the paints so that they can blend in together, because we want our paints to transition from one color into the next so they blend in. So I am starting with purple. Now I'm going to put the purple up at the top. And you can use whatever colors you want. So these are really fun and very useful for experimenting with your paints, your colors. You really can't mess this up. So it's a good opportunity to play around with your colors, learn what they look like, have some fun with them, and just to see what combinations you like, what ones you don't like. Now the other thing, like what I did right there, is you can pick up some paint on your brush and tap it and let it just kind of go where it wants to go. And with the wet on wet, as you see, it kind of bleeds out. It does its own thing and just sort of spreads out where it wants to. And that's something you may or may not want it to do. That's up to you. But you can play around with those, you know, like these cloud effects that you might want to have in your sunset, because we're painting a sky. We're looking at how the sunset's gonna look, and you might want to put some little areas of your color. And if the edges look too harsh, if they're not soft enough, because with the sky and we want it to look soft, you can just go back over it with water. And that's one of the things I really love about watercolor, is that it's very forgiving. So you have a lot of opportunity to go back in with some water and fix it. You can lighten areas up by adding a little bit of water, and then either soaking it up with your brush. You can dry your brush and lift the paint back up, or you could use a napkin, which would pull a little bit more of it up. But you can go back over, rework it, make it lighter, make it darker, which is the thing that's really, really nice about watercolors. And then you can just look at it, look at how your colors are. You want some lights and darks and a little bit of variation. But this is a really, really good type of painting to do if you're new to watercolors and you're just learning how to use them and how to control your colors and how they look. So I think this is it for this background. And then we're going to do some other stuff over top of it, but it has to dry first. So we're going to go ahead and let that dry. And then we'll come back and we'll put something over the front of it, maybe some palm trees or something. And you could also do this sideways, so that your paper would be this way, and then have your sunset going down, and then it would give you a little bit more room to make some kind of a scene down here. Either way's fine, that's up to you. It just really depends on what you're going for, what you want your end results to be. And you might want to do both. You might want to do several backgrounds. So you could take, I got this on a board that I had from something else that I cut down. And you could put as many cards or however many pieces of paper you could fit on here, and then just do a bunch of them and then set them aside, and then you would have them and you could do some cool little drawings over top of them, and then you would just have them for later, which would be nice. So we're going to let this dry, and then we will come back to finish up our sunset drawings. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do another one of these real quick. And this water's not super clean right now. That's okay. It's not too dirty. It's not going to be that noticeable. But I'm going to do this one with more blues, I think. Just to show you a little bit of some variation of what you can do. And again, I love this type of painting for anyone who's just starting out playing around with watercolors. If you're brand new to watercolors and you have no idea how to get started, you don't know what to do, maybe you've been putting it off for a while, and I'm just tapping here like I talked about a little bit earlier. And when you do that, it lets it do its thing. It will follow the texture in the paper, and where the water is, the water will pull it. The more pooled up the water is, it'll kind of suck that paint into that area. So I'm using that same watercolor set. I'm just choosing a different combination of colors. So what you can do is put down your first layer of paint, and then you can go back in over top of it with more paint and then darken up some areas. Now you can also wait for this to dry and then go back in with another layer over top of the dried paint, but when you do that, it's not going to blend in as much and you'll have harder edges. But as I mentioned earlier, I want soft edges because we're doing clouds in the sky, and the effect I'm going for is to have these colors blending in together and having that softer look to them. But if you let it dry and then add the paint over top of it, your colors will be a lot brighter. I think that's it. I like that. I got some variation of light and dark in here. And it's going to look a little bit different as it dries. So keep that in mind. It's not going to look exactly the way it does now. So don't get too worried about it being exactly perfect, because it's probably going to look different anyway. So I'm going to show you, we're going to let this dry also here. So I can show you this one. You can see it's starting to dry, and as it does, you see these little wispies in here look pretty nice. Those didn't show up as much when they were wet, but I like that effect there. That looks nice. This is still wet. We're going to let it dry completely 100% before doing anything with it. So it's going to need quite a bit of time to dry. I'll probably let these sit overnight and then finish working on them in the morning. So we'll come back when these are dry. All right, so here's the dried painting for the background for our watercolor sunsets. I went ahead and removed the tape. So I like to remove the tape while the paint is not completely dry, but dry enough that the water's not pooled up on there anymore. Sometimes if you leave the tape on there for too long, it'll tend to pull the paint off. Everything sticks together, it gets dried, and the paint itself will stick to the tape, and then it kind of combines it with the paper, and it'll rip the paper and take some of the paint off sometimes. So it's kind of, you just got to figure out what works and experiment a little bit and do whatever works best for you. So the next thing is to do some kind of a foreground in here. And I like doing just simple black silhouettes. I like the contrast between the colors in the background and the black of the silhouette drawing. But of course, you can do whatever you want. If you come up with some cool, fun ideas, go with it, try it out. These don't take that long to paint. The longest is just the dry time, but if you do a bunch of them and know in advance that you're going to paint one day and then maybe the next day you're going to do the drawings, or a couple days later or something, you can knock out a bunch of these backgrounds really quickly and then just have a stack of them that you can experiment and try some different things on. So I'm just going to use a black marker, and this is a dual tip, and I like this bullet point that it has on it. Works really well for this. You might want the tape on there for this part of it so you don't have to worry about going over the edges, but that's up to you. It depends. It doesn't really matter that much. There's really no right or wrong way. If you put the tape on, it might leave an edge. That's, you know, where there's a little bit of paint showing and whatnot. So you might have to go back in and touch it up anyway. So for this one, I'm going to do a little desert scene. So I'm just going to start by putting in the ground. And you could do this with paint. You could do it with paint markers. You could draw it on with pencil first if you feel like you need to do that. Like with anything in art, I like to say there's really no right or wrong way, but I tend to get a lot of pushback when I say that because there are so-called rules to art, but I don't think they're meant to be followed, to be honest. So I feel like you should just do whatever you want to do and see what happens. So one of the things with the markers on this textured paper is you will have some spots that don't fill in solid. So you might want to do this with paint, or you could always go back over it with like maybe some acrylics or some gouache or something a little more opaque. So there's my ground. And then what I want to do is have off to the side, I want to have a cactus coming up into the background, but sort of cropped out, cut off right at the edge. So this paper does tend to curl when it dries, so it is curled up a little bit, which makes it a little bit more challenging, but just kind of hold it down with your finger. And I'm just going to draw the outline of the cactus. And I'm going to have it come up and just kind of go off the edge of where the frame of the paper is. So I'm going to try doing this other side. So this is a dual tip marker, which is nice because you can go back and forth between the different nibs for whatever your purposes are, whichever one works best. This one does seem like it's filling it in a little bit better. So you just got to play around, experiment. Like I said, the best thing you can possibly do is just to keep working on different things, try different things out, which is really why I love working on the artist trading cards, is because they save me so much time. It really gives me the freedom to play around and experiment. If you spent an hour on a drawing, you're not going to be as likely to experiment with it as you would if you only spent 10 or 15 minutes on something. You have a lot more freedom to play around, try different things, see what they look like. So there is the finished drawing. As you can see, this didn't take very long. It's nothing fancy. But if your goal is to learn to use watercolors and learn how the colors blend together and how the paint themselves function, these are really, really simple to do. This is a great beginner play around, learn the watercolors, and then you can also have your finished drawing or artwork, whatever you want to call it, when you're finished with it. So it's just a really nice opportunity to get some practice in and not spend a ton of time, but it gives you a good opportunity to kind of play around with it, which is nice. So we're going to go ahead and do this other one. So if you remember from yesterday, we did two. So we did the one that was up and down, the portrait, and then we did one that was landscape orientation. So for this one, I like to do some little, like, I guess you would call them like a prairie scene, like kind of a little Western looking feel to it, or sometimes a little cityscape. So I'm just going to, once again, I'm going to start by putting in where my ground is. And then I'll come back in and I'll fill that in. So then the next thing I want to do is I want to put in a fence here. So I'm going to start by doing the posts. And I want this to look like an old rickety fence that's kind of fallen down. So all I'm doing is I'm going to put the post in and I'm eyeballing where they go and trying to get them roughly the same distance apart in the same height for the posts. But I'm not too worried about them being perfect. I've actually spent quite a few years working on not feeling like everything has to be perfect, because what I would do is when I was working on my art, if something didn't come out exactly the way I wanted it to, I would get really discouraged. And usually what would end up happening is I would just quit working on it because I would get frustrated, or I'd get upset because I put so much time into it and then something got messed up or didn't look right. And then I would just kind of abandon the whole thing because I was frustrated with the fact that things weren't perfect. So I've really spent a lot of time working on letting myself just enjoy the process of doing my artwork and not focusing so much on everything being perfect and the final outcome being the only thing that matters. So it really depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to do. If you're doing your artwork because you enjoy it and it relaxes you, then being so hung up on the results and the outcome is not going to work out very well for you. So of course what I'm doing now is I'm just going in and putting in the rail pieces. And again, I want this to look like it's old and kind of falling apart. so I have them falling down. And again, they don't have to be perfect. They're not going to be where they would actually be on a real fence, and that doesn't matter for the purposes of this drawing. So you really need to keep in mind, like I said, what are your goals? What are your intentions with your artwork? It's a very different path and a very different process for someone who is a hobby artist. And so like for me, I consider myself a hobby artist, which just means that I make my artwork because I enjoy it. And I don't really have any intentions to do anything different. At this point, I'm not trying to go into art shows. I'm not trying to sell my work. I don't want to be a commercial artist or anything like that. I enjoy teaching it, and I enjoy making it, and that's enough for me. At least at this point in my life, I don't really have any intentions of doing anything different. Now, if your goal was that you want to be a professional artist and make a living with your art, then that would be something completely different, and your path would look much different. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to put a tree in. Nothing fancy. I'm just putting in the branches. And you can do this, again, like with everything, there's a million different ways you can do it. Most of this I'm going to cover up, so I'm not too worried about it. I don't need a bunch of detail in there because it's getting covered up anyway. So I'm just going to put some, because this is a silhouette, right? We're not doing these big details. So I'm just putting in some leaves. And all I'm doing is adding in some different size dots. And trying not to make them, I don't want them to be like perfect circles, because leaves really aren't perfect circles. So I'm trying to make them a little more organic shaped. But I'm not trying to spend a ton of time on it either. So a lot of what we draw is a symbol of whatever it is. So you can draw a house and not add a bunch of detail. You know, think about the houses little kids draw when they're, you know, in kindergarten style houses. A kindergartner can draw a house and you know it's a house. It's a symbol of a house. So especially with these silhouettes, they're really just a symbol of the object. So somebody looks at it, they can see, yeah, that's a tree. It's not, you don't have to have a ton of detail. You can make it very detailed if that's what you want to do. If that's the style you're going for. But again, like I said, you have to know what your goals are for your art, why you're creating art, why you want to work on it, why do you want to learn watercolor. And then that should determine where you're focused at and the things that matter and don't matter to you personally. And I think this one's pretty much done. So there's that one, kind of a western prairie look to it. And then there's the other one. We'll put them side by side there. And that's it. Nothing fancy. We don't have to overcomplicate things. The most important part about learning art and learning to draw is just practicing and doing things. And the more you do, the better you'll get. So if you're spending hours and hours to make a painting perfect, you're not getting the same level of practice in as if you're doing a bunch of different drawings and paintings and just working on your quantity. And they say quantity over quality if you want to get better at something and learn a new skill. And of course, we don't want to knock out a bunch of junk, but if you want to get the practice in and you're learning watercolors, you want to do as many of these as you can, or some other type of painting. But I think these are a really easy way to practice your watercolors, and then also have just some nice little pieces of artwork that look finished. So I hope you found this useful and feel inspired to do your own watercolor sunsets, and I will see you soon. Happy creating! So how did you do? Hopefully you followed along with the tutorial and worked on your own artwork. If you enjoyed this and you want to get notified of other lessons that are coming up in the future, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and you'll get notified whenever something new gets uploaded. Have a good day and happy creating!